recording. So it might not be wise after you witness to someone to continue to witness if they continue to reject it, because the Lord says the more you know, the greater will be your, I can't put it into words exactly, but the more you know, the more you'll be held responsible for if you reject it. It may not be wise to continue witnessing to those who will not hear. A lot of times I feel that some of the last people you probably need to witness to are your family members. Because you think they know you kick the dog, they know you do things that aren't the best in the world, and so maybe your witness is not the best to people who know you the best. I don't know. Pray for them, certainly. Nothing wrong with that. But sometimes I think it's kind of like I mentioned to Teresa. In your relationship with your wife or a family member, you might tell them something 10 times, and then they hear it somewhere else, and they say, "Did you know such and such?" I say, "Yeah, I told you that 10 times." It's like the first time they heard it. I don't know. We get tuned out a lot in our families. Probably rightfully so. He did not come to bring peace but a sword. He says in verse 35, "For I've come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be members of his own household." So, just because you have been regenerated, just because you are Christ's, doesn't necessarily mean that your wife or your child or your father or your mother will come to the Lord. But you hope they will, you pray they will, but it's not necessary. The Lord, as they say, has no grandchildren. Just because you're a Christian, it may not be the same situation with your kids. He says in 37, "Anyone who loves his father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And anyone who does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me." There's been a lot of people talk about taking up their cross and following Jesus. A lot of people have interpreted that to mean different things. I think we heard in here, either from Charles or Larry, it literally means dying to self. Die. Figuratively, you die on a cross, okay. But die to yourself. Live for Christ. Live for His kingdom. He says in 39, "Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." So there we are, losing our life. Lose yourself to the Lord. In 40, he says, "He who receives you receives me, and he who receives me receives the one who sent me," that is the Father. "Anyone who receives a prophet, because he is a prophet, will receive a prophet's reward. And anyone who receives a righteous man, because he is a righteous man, will receive a righteous man's reward. And if anyone gives a cup of cold water to any one of these little ones, because he is my disciple, I tell you the truth, he will certainly not lose his reward." That's kind of similar to that part, I think it's in Matthew 24, where it's judgment, where he says, if you give someone something to eat, to any of the least of these you do it to me. And that's what Jesus is basically saying. Be merciful to your fellow human beings. I really studied and meant to talk to you about chapter 12, and here we are just in the first part of 11. Let's go through this just a little bit. In verse 11, chapter 11, verse 1, "After Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. When John heard in prison what Christ was doing, he sent his disciples to ask him, 'Are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else?'" Here, poor John, he's in prison. He's saying, "Was I mistaken? Were you the one, or is there somebody else coming here? I'm sitting in jail, and this isn't the best deal in the world." Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the good news is being preached to the poor. Blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me." As we talked about before, as Dr. Boyce made clear previously, these healings of Jesus were not only healings for healing's sake, they also authenticated who he was, and they were a type or a picture of what he was doing to their sin. He was healing them of their sin sickness. As I mentioned before, it's not from me, it's from other people. I just regurgitate what I hear. Let me get this right. I always want to say it backwards. We're not sinners because we sin. We sin because we're sinners. That's the way we're born. As Charles was very quick to say, that is our nature. Just like a bird has a bird's nature. That bird does bird things. A dog does dog things. You don't find a bird barking. You don't find a dog flying. Birds do what birds do. Dogs do what dogs do. Fallen man does what fallen man does. He sins. I think there's a psalm that says something like, even the plowing of the field is sin for the unregenerate. They can do nothing but sin. Thank the Lord, we're schizophrenic. We have the Lord living within us. There's some things the Lord does through us that are good, but it's not of us. But thankfully, some things do occur. Fruit does occur if we are the Lord's. So that's a good thing. But the unregenerate, they can do nothing but sin. Every motive is for their enrichment and their betterment. I don't care if they grab a little girl out from the wheels of a semi-truck. Everything they do is sin. They can't do anything good because Christ is not in them. And that's the only place that good comes from. Anybody? Yeah.
Just to light things up maybe a little bit, there's a preacher dead now named Griswold in Mississippi years ago. And he said, you know, what you just said. He says it's the nature of a lion to eat meat. It's the nature of the bird to fly. It's the nature of the dog to bark. He says, and it's the nature of a goat to butt. He said, and so there is your Armenian. He said, you say this, and he'll say, yes, but.
Oh.
He says the Armenian will butt you every time.
You know where that's, another place that's applicable is the sheep-goat judgment.
Yeah, that's why you use goat.
That's neat. Well, it also goes with butt.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
That's pretty good. It's a nice.
It wasn't me, it was other Griswold. He was a great guy.
Looking at that situation. Yeah. Laura Ingraham calls them butt monkeys. You ever listen to Laura? These politicians, they always say, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, but. You know, they always have a but in there. In verse 7 of chapter 11, as John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. What did you go out into the desert to see? A reed swayed in the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No. Those who wear fine clothes are in kings' palaces. Then what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. There's a lot of interpreters of the Bible who believe that John was the Elijah spoken about in Malachi, the last book of the Bible. So, you know, is that one? Elijah, I'm sorry. He is the Elijah. He is Elijah. And it goes on to talk about that. I think in verse 11, I tell you the truth, among those born of women, there's not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet, he who is the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing, and forceful men lay hold of it. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John, and if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. He who has ears, let him hear. So, it is believed and stated here by Jesus that John was in fact the Elijah who was to come and who was prophesied in Malachi. The greatest verse for me, and a lot of times, I think I mentioned this, we make trouble a lot of times when we have our favorite verses and we try to pass them on to other people, and it really doesn't mean anything to other people, or it might. I don't know. But for the most part, you know, you gather up your favorite verses and you give them to someone else and they read them and say, okay, that's great. But one of my favorites is the end of Matthew 11, where it begins in 28. Because I'm so sensitive to teachers and preachers who try to tell us things that we got to do. We got to do. And Jesus said that it's finished on the cross. It's all done. And that's the greatest thing about Christianity. All the other belief systems in the world, every single one, every single belief system in the world except for Christianity gives you things to do.
Yeah.
But not Christianity. All the other belief systems are spelled D-O. Ours is spelled D-O-N-E. Done. It's over with. And it just bugs the heck out of me when preachers tell me to do 5 things that start with G. Or, I say, don't tell me what to do. Tell me who God is. In verse 28, that's the verse. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. He will give you rest. It's talked about that so many times in Hebrews. We've seen the rest. It's all through Hebrews. He says in verse 29, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find. You will find. First he gives you rest, and here he shows you, you will find it in him. He says you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. By the way, these are the only verses in the whole Bible that describe Jesus, and the two words are I am gentle and humble in heart. And you will find rest for your soul. Rest. That's what you find. You don't find a to-do list. Anytime you hear somebody talking about things you need to do, just tune them out or jump them. It's just silly. There's nothing to do.
Don't know if it's true or not, but Mr. Schofield says concerning verses 28 through 30 that this is a turning point in Jesus' message. I haven't thought about it much, but
do you believe?
That's what he says.
You believe that he's saying that this is the end of his public ministry and he begins the private ministry?
I'm not sure.
I haven't heard that so much as that it's later on when he begins his upper room. That's where he departs from his public ministry and where he's talking a great deal to the Pharisees and Sadducees, and then he begins his private ministry. But anyway, Mr. Schofield believes this is a pivotal verse.
Yes.
It is, something changes after this.
Yes.
He doesn't really say what it is, though. Then it's just phenomenal. You read these verses and you think, why, and it's what Larry was talking about last week, those people who flirt with the law, flirt with the old covenant. They find things to do. They find, they read the Bible and it says to do this and do that in the Old Testament, in the Old Covenant, and people want to do that. It's just silly. It's just silly. We can't be flirting with the law. There's nothing wrong with the law. It's perfect. It's eternal. It's how man uses it. If you use it to obtain righteousness, it's wrong. The law is meant to drive you to Christ. What's the second purpose?
It's the right way to live.
Okay, it's good. It's good for you to follow the law. The third one is wrong.
No, wrong.
Yeah.
Wrong.
It's meant to beat you into submission. That's wrong.
Just wrong.
Wrong. That's putting a burden on you. Christ says no. As Cliff Sanders said, he said, why does the Lord want you not to sin? Why? And his answer was, and I agree with it, there may be more than this. He said, it's not good for you. It's not good for you to sin. It's just like when you're a kid. It's not good for you to play in the street. That's why your mama said, get out of the street or I'm going to light up your hiney. It's not good for you. Sin is not good for you. That's a reason not to do it. So that's one reason for the law. Another reason is it is to drive you to Christ when you realize you can't keep it. But you shouldn't deal with the third use of the law, which is meant to beat you into submission. Yeah.
I've said this many times, but it's just worth saying again and again and again. It's just my opinion, my belief that John Calvin, we claim to be Calvinists around here, but John Calvin did more to hurt the church by his third use of the law than all that he's written to help the church. I find him the biggest enemy of the church, in that only so far as his third use of the law. It's just horrible, and it transcends all denominations. And everybody believes it.
People want to go along with it.
Wrong.
Does that third use of the law, does that imply that you can keep the law, so you should try?
No, but it doesn't imply that you should try. It's the only thing that will keep you on the road. It's the only thing that will keep you straight, is because the flesh is lazy. And so the law, you need the law as a whip to whip you into submission so that you can be sanctified in this life. There is no truth to any of that. The truth of sanctification is found in Romans chapter 6, verses 1 through 11.
Yeah. Consider yourselves dead to sin. Dead. Yeah, in our Thursday morning study, Gene Benning, he's got all the institutes of Calvin. He believes so stridently that Calvin can do no wrong. And
Right.
I mentioned to him that Calvin, a lot of things he did that were very good, but I said his third use of the law was horrible, and he didn't exactly know what I was talking about, and I didn't I didn't overtly articulate it at that moment either, but I just wanted to let him know that I don't care what theologian you read, they've all got some problems. Certainly Luther did as well. I think theologian gets so fixated in one area that he's weak in other areas. So it doesn't matter who you study; they're all going to have some problems. Schofield, you know, there'll be some problems with him. I've got some problems with some of the things I read in Boyce yesterday. So, and Cliff Sanders always said it's like eating fish. You eat the flesh and spit out the bones. So, you're going to find problems with all the guys. In chapter 12, it says, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." Jesus said, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? They entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple desecrate the day and yet are innocent? I tell you, one greater than them, one greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." In other words, hey, I am the Sabbath, buddy. What are you talking about? He's standing right here in front of you. The immediate cause of the Pharisees, Mr. Boyce says, the immediate cause of the Pharisees' fierce opposition was Jesus' disregard for their detailed rules of how to keep the Sabbath, rules that were difficult to follow and a burden for anyone to bear. Matthew suggests this, by the way, in the first verse of chapter 12, and it follows significantly from the last verse of the preceding chapter. Jesus had invited the common people to follow him, promising, "My yoke is easy, my burden is light." But in the very next verse, we read that Jesus and his disciples were going through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and everyone who read that would immediately think of the burdensome Sabbath regulations. There was justification for the leaders' proper concern of the Sabbath. Of course, for one thing, the command to keep the Sabbath is fourth in the commandments, and no command of God can ever be treated lightly. Even today, the solemnity of the Sabbath command should challenge us concerning what we do on Sunday. I don't know about that. That sounds a little work-related there. Second, the leaders could not forget that one of the reasons given for the exile of the people to Babylon was that they had not kept the Sabbath, and the exile lasted until the missed Sabbaths had been made up. At the end of 2 Chronicles, we read that Cyrus carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. So the land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation rested, until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of Lord spoken by Jeremiah. What has Jeremiah said? He had warned, "If you do not obey me and keep the Sabbath day holy by not carrying any load as you come through the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then I will kindle an unquenchable fire in the gates of Jerusalem that will consume her fortresses." Here's some interesting things. We're just talking about keeping the Sabbath. Many Jews undoubtedly kept the Sabbath in the right spirit, just as Christians keep a strict observance of the Lord's Day today, out of love for God and a desire to set aside at least one day holy for spiritual matters. What was the problem then? The problem was that the Pharisees had added man's regulations to God's law, reducing a right observance of the Sabbath to the most terrible forms of legalism. Here's a couple of examples. The law said that one was not to travel on the Sabbath. Fair enough, but what constitutes traveling? Well, here's where man gets in the mix. An answer, they developed the concept of a Sabbath day's journey, roughly 1,000 yards. Why not 999? Why not 1,001? I don't know. They come up with 1,000. A man could walk that far on the Sabbath, but if he went farther, it was sin. However, if a rope was tied across the end of a street, the whole street technically became one dwelling place. And in that case, a person could walk 1,000 yards beyond the rope. I mean, they come up with all this nonsense. Or if he deposited some food at a given place on Friday night, on the next day he could walk to it, eat his meal, thereby technically establishing a new home, then could go 1,000 yards beyond that. I suppose that if he were clever enough, a determined man could walk halfway across Palestine. I mean, man comes up with so many ways to get around these silly or ways to observe these ordinances. And as he says, there's nothing wrong with God's law. It's man's interpretation or the way man tries to make these things appear. It's just nonsensical. The law forbade carrying a load. You couldn't carry a load on the Sabbath. But what's a load? Was a piece of clothing a load? The Pharisees answered that if it was worn as clothing, it wasn't. It wasn't a load if you wore it. If it was worn, it was not. But if it was carried, if you carried something, then it was a load. So the way to get a jacket from one room to another on the Sabbath was obviously to put it on, walk to the second room, and take it off. You were over in the Holy Land. There's nothing holier about that place than here. But anyway, you were in the Holy Land, and on the Sabbath over there, they have some funny deals. Like when you go eat at a restaurant, usually it's a buffet, I think, so there's no preparation food. Elevators stop on every floor. If you push a button, you're in trouble. You're not allowed to push a button. So you get on and go ahead.
Because the Sabbath, there's two reasons for the Jews to keep the Sabbath, and one was creation.
Mm-hmm.
They were celebrating God's finished work in 6 days by resting on the seventh, which is great if you're Old Covenant person. So the Jews have got this idea that you're jacking around with creation whenever you cause a circuit to either go on or off. So you can't have a circuit go on, or you cannot have a circuit go off during the Sabbath. So when we were over there on Friday evening and Saturday evening, we got to ride up and down in our hotel by this elevator that just stopped. It stopped and opened the doors on every floor, going up and going back down. At least you didn't have to walk up the stairs, which, by the way, would have been fine. You're not breaking the Sabbath by walking up the stairs, but you cannot have a circuit break, so they just turned the elevator on to open on every floor, and that's called a Sabbath elevator.
You're not allowed to push that button. Mike?
That I didn't know, but if you would have pushed the button, it wouldn't have worked anyway.
Oh. Mike has all these Jews walking past his house on Friday night, right? And Saturday morning. And I've seen those people walking from well beyond Quail Springs Mall. And I want to stop and roll down the window and say, how far are you allowed to walk on this day? They got the big black hats and the curls, and yeah.
Tom, I'm sorry to keep interrupting.
No, that's great.
This stuff, and to show you how religion, and I'm not saying correct religion, I'm just saying how religion and the leaders of religion, how they affect our culture. There used to be, in New York and other large cities, what we call ghettos.
Mm-hmm.
These ghettos were Jewish ghettos. It's where all the Jews lived. But the rabbis came up, I forget, in the 40s or 50s, I'm not sure just when, but the rabbis came up with a law that said it's okay to start your car on the Sabbath. It's okay to drive on the Sabbath. And when they did that, up until that time it was illegal because you're jacking around with circuits. So they said, but that you don't do that except for a car. A car you can drive, you can start and drive. And because of that, the ghettos kind of went away. Because
they could travel beyond it.
You don't go to New York or Baltimore or Pittsburgh or anywhere now and find a Jewish ghetto. They're scattered all over town. Yes, by Mike, they live close, but there's also Jews in other parts of the city. And the reason for that is they can drive now to the synagogue. They don't have to walk. If they had to walk, they would all be together. And that just shows you the culture of America and other countries around the world because of religious beliefs.
So they could disperse more because they had automobiles now to utilize on the Sabbath.
You could live in Edmond and still go to the synagogue over by Mike if you wanted to.
I saw a 2-hour show on who lives in Lancaster? Amish, which are very close to the Mennonites in belief. And I was always amazed that they could use gasoline engines for harvesting purposes to harvest crops, but they couldn't drive automobiles. They had to have horses and buggies, and I thought there was a conflict. I thought there was something wrong with that, but there was a reason for that. They believed that if you could drive a car, that you could travel farther afield, and these communities would be broken up. So they didn't want you to be able to do that. Indeed, some Amish communities forbid the use of bicycles, others you can. Again, for that very same reason that you can go beyond your area and, in essence, go beyond your fellowship area or whatever. But so I saw, so in my mind there wasn't a big conflict. It wasn't the utilization of the gasoline engine. It was what you used it for. You could thresh with it, but you couldn't drive with it because that would allow you to get farther away from your fellow Amish people. It's interesting to know why people do these things. I've heard stories about people, Jews who will tear toilet paper on Friday before sundown so they can use it Friday night and Saturday. They don't want to tear toilet paper on the Sabbath. Yeah.
I don't know if I've told you guys this or not, but when I was over there at the wall, this great big guy came out with his hat and his curls and everything in his uniform. He was irate. And they got to be real careful over there because there's so much tension that the Army's always there to straighten it. He come out just to hollering and jumping on these people that was in charge of that. And the Army came in and tried to settle him down, and that wasn't helping. I mean, he was irate. And the reason he was irate, here we are in this wonderful sanctified church, but the reason he was irate is because they had not left enough torn toilet paper in the stalls, and so he was in big trouble because he could not use regular toilet paper because he'd have to rip it. And when you rip something, you change creation. You can't
it's work. Grapes. It's also work.
You can't take grapes off a vine. You've got grapes in your house, a clump of them. You can't take them off on the Sabbath and eat one.
Why don't you just pull a Gentile in there and let him pull it for him?
Do what?
Why don't you just pull a Gentile in the bathroom?
I'd be glad to help him.
Would you please tear some toilet paper for me? My daughter. How late were you last night? How late were you up last night?
Me.
You and your wife. You're both. Oh, you've been sick. Okay. Well, lay down there. Take it easy. My daughter was a nanny in New York. I really hated that. I had a restaurant. I hated that too, as Mike can tell you. We'd rather take a beating every day than go to the restaurant. It's awful. Don't ever get in the food business. But anyway, one of the great things though was I had my daughters working with me. And Susan was working with me 18 hours a day. And then she decided to go to New York and be a nanny. She answered an ad. And in fact, I told her to do it one time before. She'd done it before. Went down to Texas, though. It wasn't like going overseas. But anyway, golly, she left me. And that's like a death in the family. You're with somebody 18 hours a day, and all of a sudden they're not there anymore. It takes a couple of weeks to get over that. It's hard. But anyway, she went up there to be a nanny in Rockland County, which is just outside of Manhattan, across the Tappan Zee Bridge. And right next to where the housing addition she was in was a county or an enclave, I can't remember, but they were all Hasidic Jews. And they were pretty well-to-do as well, and they had nannies. A lot of times they'd have parties, and here's the adults partying, and here's the nannies in another room with their charges, so they talk among themselves. And these nannies of the Jews talked about how they worked them to death on the Sabbath. Oh, I can't do anything. Could you, do that for me, blah, blah, blah. They would just work them to death. I told my daughter, I said, share the commandment with them. Because it says on it, that's on the Sabbath, you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your maidservant or manservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. I said, show them that. Next time you have a little party, copy this out and give a little piece of this to the other nannies. And they can show, I can't do any work either. Get a revolt going. Yeah.
Has anyone ever seen the Hebrew Israelites, the black Israelites that wear the garb? They're big in Orlando, and I've seen them one time here in Oklahoma City.
You mean black people, actually?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't understand. There are all manner of races who claim to be Jewish ethnically. I don't, and I said I had a Jewish son-in-law, and this never came to my mind when I was around him, but I would say, how do you know you're Jewish? Because all the records were destroyed in the temple. How do you know somebody of several generations down from you didn't just wake up one day and say, I'm Jewish? And then everybody's Jew. How do you know for sure that you're Jewish? I don't think that you do know that for sure. And of course, they point to the ethnic stereotypes, large nose. My son-in-law said, "You know why Jews have such large noses?" I said, "Why?" He said, "It's because air is free." I don't know. What can I say? But I wonder that now. I'm sorry I didn't wonder that when I was in his presence to ask him, "How do you know you're Jewish? How does anybody know they're truly ethnically Jewish if all the records were destroyed?" Oh, and then Dr. Boyce says, the law forbade work. The same logic worked this way. A man is out walking. He spits. Is that work? It depends on what happens to the spit.
That changes creation.
If it goes into the dirt and makes a slight furrow, then it's plowing, which is work. If it hits a rock, no work is done. Under this system, being a devout Jew seemed to depend in part on where one spit on Saturdays. In all, the Pharisees established 39 categories of work that was prohibited on the Sabbath, and reaping, which became the chief bone of contention in this conflict with Jesus, was one of them. I read somewhere that the reason for all these laws, and there's differing views on how many, 600, 700 or whatever, these little picky laws, like you couldn't carry a needle on the Sabbath because that's an instrument of work. If you look at these, here he says there were 39 categories. I think there were really 10 categories because they seem to be hedges around each one of the commandments. All of these picky little laws. They were to keep you from getting to the biggie, the actual command. You would stop at these smaller laws before you got to the big one. That's what I've read somewhere, that these little picky laws, 600, 700 of them, were hedges around the big commandments. So in that light, there maybe are 10 categories of these. In this story, Matthew explains that Jesus and his disciples were passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath. Because his disciples were hungry, they began to pick some heads of grain, rub them on their hands to separate the grain from the chaff and eat them. There's no suggestion that the disciples were stealing. On the contrary, the right to pick and eat grain on the edges of the field were established in Deuteronomy 23:25. I don't know if you've read that, but it tells landowners not to over-glean or over-harvest their fields. Leave the corners alone for the poor, the widows, and so forth, so they can collect grain. So there was always some grain left for the less fortunate people. The sole issue of the Sabbath and the Pharisees' narrow rules for keeping it. Some years later, the famous Jewish rabbi said to pluck ears is a kind of reaping. But the disciples were guilty of more than that. According to the Pharisees, by plucking the grain, they were guilty of reaping. So right away they were reaping. Then they rubbed it and they were threshing. By blowing off the chaff, they were guilty of winnowing. And the total of those acts, they were guilty of preparing a meal, all of which was forbidden. I mean, you just can't win around these guys. How did Jesus answer? He might have answered by making some useful and right distinction. The disciples were not working at all. Plucking a few heads of grain was not harvesting. In any case, they were disciples, not farmers. But this isn't what he said. His answer was quite different. He raised three matters. The case of David, he tells them all about David's situation. The case of the priests who were working in the temple. Now, I think most of us know about David and his eating the showbread. I wasn't aware of what Jesus was talking about when he said the priests desecrated the temple. So let's see what he's talking about. Jesus' second point is one only Matthew records, no doubt because Matthew is particularly Jewish. It's a particularly Jewish gospel, and the temple was of paramount importance to the Jews. It's about work the priests did on the Sabbath. Here again, what we were talking about. These priests worked on the Sabbath. The priests worked on the Sabbath and so profaned it. Jesus uses the word desecrate by burning incense, changing the bread of the presence, and by offering double burnt offerings. By referring to this practice, Jesus showed that some work took precedence over the Sabbath laws. Since Jesus went on to say that one greater than the temple was present, meaning himself, he was teaching that the work he was doing was more important than the Sabbath regulations.
Amen.
See there? There's also a suggestion that the kingdom he was bringing would supersede the Old Testament. What words he used? Dispensation. Uh-oh. I'm over.
Good work.
Also, yeah, I'm a little of each.
Me too.
The teaching of Hosea 6:6, Jesus' third point, was a reference to Hosea 6:6, a text already cited once in Matthew 9:13, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. The point is similar to Paul's valuation of love in 1 Corinthians 13:3. If I have love, If I have not love, I gain nothing. If we do not have love or show mercy, none of the other things, such as speaking in tongues, prophesying, knowledge, or faith, are of any value. Yet, if that is true of something as important as faith, how much more a set of Sabbath regulations? He's got some more good things, but as I said, I'm over time and we need to stop for coffee. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah.